Secular accounts show no evidence of Nebuchadnezzar's madness, which is mentioned prominently in our lesson for tonight. There is recently a discovery of a cuneiform tablet which may indicate that, but it's not clear, it's not concise. So, is that a problem? After all, is Daniel an accurate book, or is it just a made-up legend? That's a question scholars have considered for quite a while. And we'll talk about that and many other things tonight in this lesson. In tonight's lesson, from pride to humility. Thank you for joining me. We're not going to take long in preliminaries here. This is pre-recorded because as I speak, as you see me now, I should be on my way to vacation land, a nice white sandy beach in Alabama, but we'll see. In any case, I didn't want to leave you without a lesson, and I apologize that it's pre-recorded, but life has its demands too. I hope you find this worthwhile. Let's begin as we'd always do with a word of prayer. Our loving Father, we thank you for the opportunity we have to come together as far apart as we may be physically and geographically, and that we may study your word. And we thank you that you have given us the word, both written and in flesh, and we thank you that you've given us minds so that we can comprehend and we can wrestle with these texts and come to an understanding of your will for us. We ask you that the Holy Spirit guide us as we study, in Jesus' name. From pride to humility. And we'll start with our memory gem, as we'd like to do. And let's put that up there. And I'll get out of your way here just briefly. From Daniel 4, verse 3, New King James Version. How great are his signs and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. This is taken from, you notice this is poetry. The Hebrew poetry did not rhyme by sound, even in the original language. Hebrew poetry is, English poetry, for example, has the mirroring of sounds, but Hebrew poetry has the mirroring of ideas. And so that's the parallelism we talk about there. It's the mirroring of ideas. And so you see this, how great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. That is a parallel. It's the same idea expressed slightly differently. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. So eventually we'll do some songs. We'll get into Hebrew poetry, which is a fascinating subject all by itself. But there is poetry here in this verse and throughout this. Well, it says from pride to humility. And pride, we say is before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Well, that's what is going to happen here. Those of us who are familiar with Daniel 4 will know this. I mentioned in the opening that there is no confirmation to the Daniel 4 madness of King Nebuchadnezzar story in secular records. And when we get done at the end of the lesson, we'll talk about that. Right now, I want to just go into it. We've talked so much about how Daniel is a book which is made up of chiasms. There are lots of chiasms in them. These are also mirroring structures, literary structures, where the first mirrors the last and the second mirrors the next to the last and so forth. And there's a lot of that taking place here in Daniel. And in this particular chapter, there is, surprise, a chiasm. And you may wonder, well, why did the author go to so much trouble? Well, because he felt his message was crucial, and he didn't want anyone to miss the crucial parts of it. We've talked already several times about the three great themes of the book of Daniel. The God who rules, the God who gives wisdom, and the God who delivers. And we will see how those fit into the story here in chapter 4. I'm doing, as always, a literary and textual analysis as well as I can do. And so I'm going to share with you this basic structure, this chiasm. I'll show you the entire chiasm from top to bottom here. And you can see it I've color-coded as well as indented. And there we go. We'll take a look at the first part. And in that first part, you can read, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, to all peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth. This is a letter from Nebuchadnezzar to all of his subjects, which is an amazing thing because he's going to humble himself here. And he is going to give his testimony to the Most High God. In fact, he begins it right here. May your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. Now, he's talking here about the God of the Jews, the God of the Israelites. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. As I mentioned, whereas English poetry mirrors sounds, the Hebrew poetry mirrors ideas, and you have parallelisms. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is everlasting, his dominion is from generation to generation. So those are parallel thoughts, and that's the way their poetry goes. And this is interesting because the king is beginning this with poetry, and he is going to do the same. Because it's a chiasm, we can expect then to find poetry at the other end as well. And here we go, taking a look at that end as well. But at the end of this period, this is after his madness, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. Note the parallelism, blessed, praised, and honored. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion. So this echoes the lines in the beginning. And his kingdom endures from generation to generation. So he's echoing what he said at the very beginning here. And I'm going to have to do a little bit of work here. There we go, to get everything in. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. There's some poetic things too, heaven and earth. And no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? At that time, my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me from the glory of my kingdom. And my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out. So I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are true, and his ways are just. And he is able to humble those who walk in pride. And this is interesting because here's this king who was so proud. And that's why our lesson is titled, From Pride to Humility. This king was so proud, and now he is grateful that God has humbled him. And of course, that's because of the great truth that God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. So Nebuchadnezzar is grateful that he is the recipient of God's grace. He is the recipient because God helped him by making him humble. It sounds, it's a very unusual thing for an ancient monarch to be saying, but there it is. All right, now we'll go back up and we'll get some of these earlier portions because we want to look and see how the story develops. You know the story, but I want to look at it here in a literary sense and just examine what's happening then in this story. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream, and it made me fearful, and these fantasies as I lay on my bed and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. So I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Notice how this is a reflection of Daniel 2. He brings in everybody. He has this dream that's troubling him, and he brings in everybody. Then the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners came in, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make known the interpretation to me. Okay, remember the three great themes. It is God who rules, it is God who gives wisdom, it is God who delivers. So, he was at ease in his palace. The parallel passage to this then is going to be at the end. And it's interesting because he's walking on his palace just before he reaps the, shall we say, the result of his pride. He's at his house again. So there you see that parallel. It's very interesting because I would expect, reading this story and knowing it ahead of time, that it would be his madness that would be in the center. But it's not. It's not in the center of the chiasm. It's not the main point of the chiasm. So I find that whole thing fascinating. So let's go back and see. Oops. Let's go back and see more here. There we go. But finally Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom it is the spirit of the holy gods. And I related to him the dream to him, saying, now this is a difference, this is a contrast. The first dream he didn't remember, but now this one he does. Still, the Chaldeans, his conjurers, and the soothsayers, they can't help him. But then he comes in here, he says, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream which I have seen, along with its interpretation. All right, so it is Daniel, and what we're going to find, of course, is that the parallel to this then will be Daniel's beginning. Daniel came into him. It's an introduction to Daniel and Daniel in the dream. And after this is going to be Daniel and then the interpretation of the dream. We're going to be introduced, as it were, again to Daniel. And he tells the details of his dream. Now these were the visions as I lay upon my bed. I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached to the sky, and was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches, and all living creatures fed themselves from it. I was looking in the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. He shouted and spoke out as follows: chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground. But with a band of iron and bronze around it and the new grass of the field, and let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 time periods pass over him. This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whom he wishes and sets over it the lowliest of men. We've talked about the three great themes of Daniel, and the God who rules is definitely here. The Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and he bestows it on whom he wishes, and sets it over the lowliest of men. Sets over it the lowliest of men. And the irony here, of course, is that Nebuchadnezzar will be restored to his throne after he literally becomes the lowliest of men, after he goes crazy. He has this mind of the beast, as it says here. And now we come to the center. The center, because remember there were three parts, the three great themes of the book of Daniel. And here we have one of them being emphasized. We have the ruler, and now it says, "This is the dream which I, Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, tell me its interpretation, inasmuch as none of the wise men of my kingdom is able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you." Then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, was appalled for a while, as his thoughts alarmed him. In other words, Daniel gets it right away. He sees it immediately, and it appalls him. It frightens him. And besides this, he has to bring this bad news to Nebuchadnezzar. And don't forget that the Oriental despots were not. It was unusual for them to kill the messenger with an unpleasant message. The king responded and says, "Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you." Belteshazzar replied, "My lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you, and its interpretation to your adversaries." So he's giving a hint here of his concern. And it's interesting because this is the center of the chiasm. The center of the chiasm is the God who gives wisdom, because I know, Nebuchadnezzar says, I know that your God can give this to you. The spirit of the holy gods is in you, and you can give me the interpretation of this. And it's interesting also because Nebuchadnezzar is comforting Daniel. Don't be appalled by this. And Daniel replies, if only it applied to those who hate you and its interpretation to your adversaries. Daniel cares about Nebuchadnezzar. And that may be the core of the message here. Not only is the God who gives wisdom, but God cares about Nebuchadnezzar. Otherwise, he wouldn't have humbled him. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this marvelous testimony, as we shall see. Chapter 4 is the last time we hear about Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. And the last bit we hear from Nebuchadnezzar will be his testimony to God. Really good. So you had the dream that was in the green section above, and now you have the confrontation where Nebuchadnezzar says, okay, you can interpret it, tell me the interpretation. Daniel's troubled by the interpretation, and Nebuchadnezzar comforts him and says that he need not be alarmed, although I'm not sure how much that helped. And here it comes. The tree which you saw, let's get it up there, which became large and grew strong, and whose height reached to the sky and was visible to all the earth, and whose foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in which it was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and in whose branches the birds of the sky lodged. This beautiful picture, both in his dream and as Daniel is repeating it, is God's depiction of Nebuchadnezzar. For all his faults, Nebuchadnezzar is a blessing to the earth, a blessing to his empire, according to the way this is depicted. It is you, O king, that tree. It is you. You are this blessing. It is you, O king, for you have become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached to the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. in that the king saw an angelic watcher, a holy one, descending from heaven and saying, "Chop down the tree and destroy it, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it and the new grass of the field. And let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beasts of the field until 7 periods of time pass over him." This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place be with the beasts of the field, and you be given grass to eat like cattle, and drenched with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whomever he wishes. And that was commanded to leave the stump with the roots of the tree, your kingdom will be assured to you after you recognize that it is heaven that rules. Again, the 3 great themes. Wow, here we have it. We have the God who rules. We already have that twice now, emphasized. We have the God who gives wisdom, because he's giving the interpretation of the dream to Daniel. All that's left is the God who delivers. So Daniel's not just there just to interpret the dream, but also he's an advisor. And advice he will give. Therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. This is already after the time of Jonah, when God, because the Ninevites repented, God did not destroy Nineveh. And so Daniel has this reference, and he says, do the right thing now, and maybe God will prolong your prosperity. Maybe this won't have to happen to you. And remember that this is Nebuchadnezzar's account. Nebuchadnezzar is writing this letter to everyone. Really a singular thing for an ancient monarch to do, especially these Oriental despots. They all pride all the time. All this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king 12 months later. He was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. We often get scared by things and say, I'll reform. We talk about God, in the foxhole. That there's no atheists in foxholes. Well, when the danger's passed, it's easy to forget what our promises were, the bargains we made with God. And apparently it took 12 months before he, and his sin isn't necessarily doing terrible things. Look what his sin is. Sovereignty has been removed from you, and you will be driven from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it upon whomever he wishes. Must have been frightening words. He'd been warned about this. He'd been told about this. And yet, here he is. It's easy for us to think we are, in times of prosperity, it's easy to think we're the ones who make things good. And sometimes the only way we can be brought to God is to realize that we don't do these things, and that prosperity is taken away from us, so we have to depend upon God. And certainly that's the position you are if you're a beast in the field. You're at the mercy of the weather. You're at the mercy of all sorts of things. Not like, living in a house and so forth. Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. And he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle. and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like birds' claws. Well, and again, this is Nebuchadnezzar describing to his entire kingdom, this is what happened to me. I was reduced to the status of a beast. And finally we come to the end. But at the end of the period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. But he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth. And no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? At that time, my reason returned to me. He recognizes God as the one who rules, and God returns his rule to him. There can be no better parable of the Christian life when we give up the throne of our lives to God and say, you are the one who rules. I want you to rule my life. He gives us true self-control for the first time. Until then, we're always choosing the evil. We are slaves. We are slaves to sin. And when we recognize that we should be his servants, he gives us back our personal sovereignty. Same thing happening here. That time my reason returned to me, my majesty and splendor were restored. For the glory of my kingdom and my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out, so I was established in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. But the difference is that now Nebuchadnezzar recognizes that it comes from God, not from himself. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. We have seen the God who rules repeatedly in this chapter. We have seen the God who gives wisdom, as he gave wisdom to Daniel. But now he's giving wisdom to Nebuchadnezzar, because it's wisdom to recognize that God rules. And we now see him as the God who delivers, because what did he deliver Nebuchadnezzar from? He delivered him from his pride. How many of us would need to be delivered from our pride? I certainly am one. C.S. Lewis says in one place, if you don't think you're very proud, if you think you're humble, you're very proud indeed. Pride is so ingrained in us as human beings. And so here we have, in the story of Nebuchadnezzar, in this king, in this ruler of empire, we have an example of the God who delivers. He delivered Nebuchadnezzar from the prison of his own pride, because that's what put him in the field. He delivered Nebuchadnezzar from the illusion that he was the ruler. He delivered Nebuchadnezzar from his own ignorance and gave him wisdom. And so this is a marvelous story, but it also tells the exiles, if this story is circulated among the exiles in Babylon, it tells them God still rules. Can you imagine being a Jew in exile? You're a captive, you're in Babylon, and you're subject to this ruler, and you don't hear about him for a while, and then he comes out with this declaration, this open letter, we would call it today. Can you imagine how that would build your faith? My God rules. and my God will deliver. That is a lesson for the ages. That is a lesson for all who want to be God's children. The lesson asks some other questions like, what's the difference between taking pride in something and being proud? And the quick answer, the short answer to that is that pride, that is a sin. The problem is oftentimes that in English we only have one word, or we tend to fill one word with lots of different meanings. There's a pride which says, I am better than you, or I am better than other people. That's the pride which is a sin. There's the pride which says, I'm on my own, I am my own ruler. That's a pride, the pride which is a sin. To say, I am proud of my children is not, unless you're saying, well, I'm such a good parent, I'm a better parent than everybody else. But if you're saying, I'm, as C.S. Lewis says it, I'm pleased to be associated with it. I'm so happy when people know that that Benjamin is my son, for example, or that Shauna or Elise are my daughters. I'm proud to be associated with them. It pleases me. I gain pleasure from that. That's okay. I am proud to be a Seventh-day Adventist. I believe in the doctrines of the church. I believe that the great controversy answers the deepest questions that we have. And I think that's a good thing. But it doesn't mean that I think I'm better than anybody else. And it doesn't mean that I think my particular denomination is full of only virtuous people and that we're somehow superior to others. That's not so. And that's the difference between I'm pleased to be associated with something and to say it's better than, I'm better than, or because I'm associated with this, I'm better than others. That is, and it's just, it can be a very short step from one position to the other. Well, we pretty well covered the lesson. I hope that these lessons are useful to you. As I said, I'm doing these pre-recorded. But as we've reaffirmed all three of the major themes here, and oh, by the way, said we deal with the issue of why, and what about the fact that it's not in secular accounts? Well, first of all, for ancient history, oftentimes the only thing we only have one source for information about a particular action. That's just the nature of ancient history. It's so far in the past that the records have disappeared for the most part. And of course, if the chroniclers of Babylon were like the chroniclers of other nations, they were paid to praise the king and to list his accomplishments. They weren't paid. They weren't paid to expose his flaws. That hasn't changed much today, and so we shouldn't be too surprised if it didn't show up in the official chronicles. Although this letter would be fascinating if we could find it. But there are lots of things I say for which we have only one source, and that doesn't mean people don't believe in them or don't believe they're true. It just means that we don't have a lot of documents from the ancient world. And there is recently a cuneiform tablet which indicates that at least for some time Nebuchadnezzar was, let's say, out of commission. He was not available. His advisors were not seeking him out. And that's specifically mentioned in our text tonight. Well, I hope you gathered from this lesson, and what I get from this lesson is, again, the amazing strength of this and the interchange between Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel is the point of the chiasm, that they had come to such a relationship that Nebuchadnezzar not only trusted that Daniel had wisdom and could interpret his dream, but that Daniel cared for him, and he should not be appalled. He didn't need to be worried about bringing bad news. because Nebuchadnezzar had come to where he apparently had strong confidence and even affection for Daniel. In fact, we will see this trait of Daniel's, that he was a likable person, at least by some. We'll see this played out in future lessons. But for now, let's just notice that God is the one who rules. He's the one who gives us wisdom, and he delivers us from everything, even our own pride, if we will let him. Praise be to God for that. Thank you, and I hope you'll be with me in a week. That one will also be pre-recorded, but I should be on my way back, and Thursday after that we'll be fine. But next week, Daniel 5. And if you remember the chiasm of Daniel 2 through 7, 4 and 5 are the point. They're both matching, and we'll see a lot about that in the next lesson, and what they tell us about God and about his saving grace. Until then, may God be with you, and may you continue to enjoy discovering treasures in his word.